True. It's going to be a fun time. Ree? Okay, let's see. Well, hello. It's time to duel. Hello, amigos. Welcome in. I just gotta get this. Can I share it to the group? Now we try. Oh yeah, buddy. Oh yeah, buddy. She's gonna work. I think it is. As long as I don't have a time limit for posting. Just setting up a couple more things and we'll be beginning shortly. I just gotta share the video. Beep boop bop. There we go. And that should be there now. Do la la la. Okie dokie. Well, I think that is it for that. Welcome in. Hello, everybody. Should be live on the Peace River General Forum now as well. Welcome into my live stream. I am going to talk about a slightly sensitive topic to some people now. I'm sure reading the name of the post is going to get a little bit of a visceral reaction from people, and that's great. Those are probably kind of the people that I want to stick around. So if you, as in the description says, if you've read any of the comments about gender, and there being more than one gender, perhaps more than two genders, genderlessness does exist, trans men are men, trans women are women. If any of these things offend you to some degree or make you have a visceral reaction, you're probably the exact kind of person that I want to be watching this. So check it out. We are going to be going through today talking about exactly why these statements are true. And we're going to be avoiding, I know a lot of people have this belief that there's probably a lot of people out there that are making their opinions based on feelings, right? Like, well, this person just feels that way and the facts don't agree with them and stuff like that. I totally agree. Lots of people have formed opinions about gender and about how many genders there are based on just their feelings alone. And I think that it would do us all really good if we just focus on the facts, focus on the things that we can prove empirically with evidence, and we'll kind of go from there. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're not going to be messing around with no feelings today. No siree. Um, yeah. So I'd like to start off this conversation with a little bit of a side note about, and it's pretty important going into this conversation that in order to learn anything um, as an individual, as a human, we need to be willing to accept those ideas as true, especially if those ideas can be proven to be true with evidence. This is a pretty important thing that if we want to make decisions and opinions and form opinions, we would hope that our opinions are formed based on things that can be proven, right? So, for example, the Earth is flat as a statement, right? We don't want to just believe that without evidence, right? So we want to make arguments as to why the Earth was not flat based on the evidence of, say, pictures or whatever evidence that we have, right? Whatever scientific evidence. You can do lots of different things. So anyways, the point is that we need to be open to accepting these ideas and stuff like that right off the bat to begin with. And we do want to be skeptical to some degree about things, right? That's why we want evidence, right? So we don't just want to be like blanket skeptical of everything. We want to accept evidence if it is sufficient evidence, right? So what I'm getting at here essentially is that we want to talk about biases going into this. So if you have read any of these statements and you feel a certain type of way about these statements, about like there being more than two genders, and that makes you feel a certain type of way or whatever, and you don't immediately agree with these things and stuff like that, that's probably okay. But you should be willing to change your mind if you've been presented evidence, which is what I want to do here today. I want to present arguments and evidence to like that degree that would change your mind essentially. And yeah, you have to be willing to some degree, right? So what we're going to start with is biases. Now, humans have biases that affect how we perceive things. This is like, they're called cognitive biases. So what that means essentially is that how we view the world as an individual, we're going to have essentially some kind of like things like that we that like help us form our opinions and stuff like that. These things would generally be biases. So like how we understand the world and stuff. And we want to try and avoid as many biases that reject evidence as possible. So for example, if I like really like was super in love with this individual, and that individual got on a plane and the plane crashed and they died, I might have like a really hard bias in believing that they're dead, because like how could they be dead? Like you might like form like irrational thought patterns essentially. That's usually what biases are, to like explain something that we aren't able to like cope with or understand. And this is especially true of something that we don't understand. A lot of times we will reject things just based on the fact that we just don't understand it essentially. And it's important that we just gain an understanding of these things in order to be more well-equipped to understanding them, right? So from that point, I want to say, moving forward, before we even begin this discussion about gender, I want everybody who's in the conversation to be completely open to the idea that what I'm going to say could very well be true. And I'm not just going to say that like as a statement that I just want you to automatically believe everything I'm saying, but I want you to consider that it's possible, essentially, right off the bat. We want to avoid having the what is it? I think it's called the pushback effect. One second. I know there's a name for this. Backfire effect, I think. Okay, yeah. So we want to avoid a backfire effect. A backfire effect occurs when an evidence-based correction is presented to an individual. So the evidence-based correction being that there are more than two genders in this circumstance. That's my argument. And it's presented to an individual, and they report believing even more in the very misconception the correction is aiming to rectify. So what that means is that like I would present you with this argument that there's more than two genders, or that the way that we understand gender as like a population or even on an individual basis is generally a little bit like wrong, and I don't want your initial reaction to just be like you feel like I'm pointing at you and saying, hey, you're wrong, and then you kind of cower back and you like cement yourself in that belief. We want to like deal with the subject matter at hand appropriately, and just, yeah, that's essentially it. So we just want to avoid that. So I want to start off this topic essentially just with that. Just try and be open to your biases, and yeah, if you think you can prove me wrong, then go ahead. So we're going to start off with, I noticed on the general forum recently we've had a little bit of discourse with like the trans topic in general and gender. So I just wanted to address a couple concepts that I saw people were getting wrong, with more than just saying you're wrong. That's like, it's possible that you could be wrong and that someone could tell you that and maybe they didn't explain it to you in a way that you understand. So I'm going to try my best to describe why these things are the way they are, essentially. So we're going to start off with the question of, are there more than two genders? How do we understand gender as a concept? As individuals, I think, and this will like spread collectively, we know of the terms male and female, guy, girl, right? These are like the most common, woman, man. These are all really common terms that we kind of use interchangeably in our day-to-day life. And they don't exactly have the same meaning when we're talking about strict definition, but we do use them very interchangeably in our day-to-day lives. What that means is that essentially, or where I'm getting at with this, is that these are the words that we use most often to describe genders and sexes. However, that doesn't mean that they should be used interchangeably. The way we understand, like, so when you're born, for example, the doctor will ascribe you a gender based on they'll ascribe you a sex based on your genitalia, and then it's kind of bestowed upon you the gender roles of that sex as well. So you're born with a penis. Traditionally, usually we label that as male, which is male and female are the names of sexes, by the way, not genders. And then from there, you adopt a male a guy or girl, woman or man, like persona of like gender. This is normally how it works for most people. And so I think that like how we individually perceive gender does do a little bit of it kind of creates our understanding of gender, essentially, as individuals. So it makes it a little bit hard to understand things that could be different or exist outside of these lines. So with this, I'm going to talk about, here, one second. Sorry, one second. Okay, so from there, this is kind of where we create like our model for like how we perceive gender as a collective, because the way that most of us are brought into the world and that gender is thrusted upon us as individuals is very much related to sex, and a lot of people they feel comfortable in that definition, and they continue to exist within that definition of the gender that's been given to them from birth. They just like it. That's how they identify. It makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, right? Now, it gets a little bit confusing for some people, because when other people come out and say that that's not how it worked for them, it seems like they're going against some kind of set of rules that we've created in society, that they're going against the actual definitions of these words. And it seems like, I think a lot of people think that it's attention seeking, and that's like the initial reaction that we have to this. Now, the truth of the matter is that gender is a lot more complex than the way that most of us perceive it as individuals. So going from there, the reason why, and I should probably actually right off the bat just make this statement, because I know people are going to make it. Gender and sex are not the same thing. They're different words for a reason. People use them interchangeably a lot. Doesn't make it correct. The words, if you could like go to Google and type in sex and type in gender, and you'll get different definitions. You do have to read the whole definition to like get that idea, right? But essentially, gender is somewhat influenced by your sex for most people. So there is some like crossover between those two terms, right? But it doesn't make gender sex. It's not the same thing at all. So, going from there, now I'm going to dive into a little bit more of why gender is complicated. So gender, we have to start off with a collective understanding between me and between you, the viewer. Something that we have to agree upon in order to move forward with this is that gender is socially constructed. So what that means is that it doesn't mean that it's not real. Something can be a social construct and be real. It is real. It's made real. It's made real because humans agree upon its existence. Because humans agree upon like how it works essentially. So a social construct, for example, could be like money is a social construct, just for like another example. It has value because we as humans give it value, and that's the social construct kind of portion of it, essentially, right? Like a piece of paper is clearly not worth $100, right? But because we ascribe that value to it, we're socially constructing it. Gender, it works very much in the same way. We've socially constructed a lot of values that we associate with words that are genders, and what they represent. And a lot of that has some overlap with sexes. So, for example, the male sex has a lot of overlap with the male gender, and most people who have the male sex will identify as a male, right? So we have a little bit of overlap there. The difference between sex and gender here is that gender is a social construct. Sex is biologically determined. So what that means is that essentially, this is a little bit like oversimplification, but essentially what that means is that if you have like a penis, then sexually you're usually a male, like you would be, essentially. And then if you have a vagina, then we would consider you like sexually to be a female. Going from there, one second, sorry guys. Okay, so going from there. Sorry guys about that. Essentially, we just want to note these differences and how we understand these things, because a lot of people's misconception starts right from this point, and we can immediately correct this and give you a very much more in-depth understanding of how these things work and how these things differ. Because a lot of people's initial reaction when they hear there's more than one gender is no, there's only two genders. There's male and there's female. But that's incorrect. You're not talking about genders at all. Like you are correct to a degree that there is male and there is female, but you're talking about sex. We're talking about gender. These are two completely different things. There, like I said, there's overlap between them, and it can get really confusing. Like gender is extremely complicated. It's not simplistic, but that's essentially the point. So, right off the bat here, I think we can solve a lot of people's misconceptions with gender just by stating that sex is different than gender, and we want to understand that. Moving forward from there now, if that's not enough to convince you right off the bat, then I want us to take another quick second, and I want us to reassess. Now, are we pivoting now? If you tell me, if your initial reaction between me saying there's more than two genders is no, there's only male and female, and then I tell you, well, you're talking about sex, and I'm talking about gender, and these things are two different things, and then you decide to change what you're saying and your argument kind of thing, are you changing your argument because you have actual good reasons to believe in that argument, or are you backing yourself into a corner? I want us to just consider right now that our bias is playing a part in why I am moving the goalpost, essentially, and at least reconsider that. Because if your only problem with gender was that there's male and female, and that's, like I said, that's sex, then clearly that's your only problem. We've disproven that. We can move forward. You can understand that there's more than two genders moving forward, or at least accept that. Now, so we've talked about the difference between sex and gender now, and that's a pretty important part to establish. Now, moving forward here, we're going to go into gender and why could there possibly be more than two genders. So we're going to get back onto our point about gender being a social construct. That's very, very important moving forward with this. So when we have words to describe things, generally, we will have very specific criteria for something to meet in order for it to be able to be defined as something. That's a little bit of jumbly words. What I'm trying to say is that for something, in order to be a square, definitively, it would have four corners, right? We would say a square is four corners and it's probably all equal sides, right? That would be a square, because if there was two longer sides, now it's a rectangle, right? So the point is that a lot of language that we use has very specific definitions. We can call these things objective, essentially. Like, it's objectively true that that a square has four corners and all equal sides, right? And it's two-dimensional. These things are all objectively true. Gender and sex work very similar, but they're not so easy to pin down on their definition, not at least in the way that you think they would. If you were to give me any kind of argument at all about why or what makes a man, or what makes a woman, you're going to have a pretty hard time giving me really specific defining features that make a man and a woman that don't also apply to the opposite gender, right? So what I mean by that is that you could say, well, women wear dresses. And we could say, okay, is that the defining feature? Does that mean that if I were to wear a dress, am I now a woman? You probably say no, because that's clearly wrong, right? Or makeup. I'm wearing makeup. Does that make me a woman? Because women generally wear makeup. No, none of these things can define being a woman or being a man very specifically, right? And this is kind of getting into the complexities of gender. How do you decide very specifically who is a man and who is a woman? What features? We should be able to point to very specific things, right? That decide if this person's a man or if this person's a woman, or if they're in between or whatever they are, right? We should be able to find these words. And you're going to have a really, really hard time by doing that. So the way we understand gender essentially is that a lot of these things, there's a lot of overlap between these things, right? It doesn't seem to me like gender is really something that that has really hard lines that define, in a spectrum. Here's your guy and here's your girl. It doesn't seem like there's really hard things that define you as being you're a real man here and a real girl here. It seems to be more of a spectrum, in that you can land anywhere on the spectrum based on a lot of these traits and stuff, right? So for example, I am a what's the word? I identify as a male or as a man, and I wear makeup and I wear skinny jeans and stuff. I wear a lot of feminine things. I present a little bit more feminine, essentially. I consider myself a guy still, 200%. But am I on the guy spectrum here? Am I right against the line here? Am I a real manly man? Probably not. I'm probably somewhere a little bit more in this area, maybe by my definition. But how do you define these things, right? It's really, really difficult to pin down that. And that's kind of where we get into the whole thing of self-identification. It's essentially like a solution for this. The way that we feel as individuals about our genders tends to be pretty much the best basis for determining gender. Because gender, like I said, it's a social construct. We don't decide that you are a man because you have a penis. We decide you're a male because you're penis, because you like have the sexual organ of a male or whatever, right? But not man. As a gender, you don't decide that you're a man because of that. You decide you're a man more personally, right? A lot of people just happen to identify with the gender they were given at birth. And so for a lot of people, there's just a coincidence that, oh, I was born as a man, also I identify as a man kind of thing. That's a coincidence, right? It's a very common one, right? I'm not saying it's like uncommon. I'm just saying that is coincidental. It's not, what would it be? It would be, that would be, my brain is having a fart. That would be correlated, not causated. I think you can essentially use that terminology with this. There's a correlation between you being like identifying as a man and being born as a male, but being born as a male does not cause you to be a man, if that makes sense. It's probably a little bit confusing for some people. So moving forward here now, it seems like gender is more of a spectrum, essentially, because you can't really like hard define things. And so like if you can't really pin down that every time you have more muscle mass, you're a man, like that doesn't like push you more, like because these specific characteristics don't push us more in one direction or more in another direction definitively, there has to be a way to define whether you're a man or a woman, right? At least when we're talking about two genders, or these two very specific genders. And for the most part, this seems to be self-determined for humans. Trans people have existed all throughout time, since the beginning. It's not a new trend. It's not some kind of indoctrination thing. They've existed in the shadows. They've existed out in the open now. This is a very, very well-known thing. It's always been this way. This is like gender does change culture to culture and stuff, but the general idea of like how it works has always been the same, and how we perceive gender has always been the same. It's a cultural thing. So going from there, now we've determined that gender is a spectrum. From there, that means that there's probably some things in between. So we have man here, and then we have woman here. There's probably some things in between, right? This is where we get our basis for there being more than two genders. Because what are all these things in between, right? So we could have like non-binary. Maybe, I don't know if that would be in like the middle of the spectrum, but we could just say for this example's sake that it's in the middle of the spectrum. Non-binary meaning they don't identify with like any of the genders. So what that means is that maybe for example, like non-binary can get really complicated. So it's probably worth looking into for anyone who's interested. But for like one example of somebody who might be non-binary, they might just reject feeling any connection to any gender at all. Perhaps they just don't feel like, or they feel like a good like mix kind of. Maybe they feel so androgynous, I guess I think would be the right word. Maybe they feel a rejection to all things that that feel like stereotypically gender associated. That could be like one example of somebody who's non-binary. Somebody else who's non-binary might combine their favorite bits of both genders together, but still reject being one or the other specifically. These people usually have pronouns being they, them. This is very, very common in English. We will even refer to people who have their pronouns as he or her. We'll constantly refer to them as they, them in like essays and stuff. You could look it up anywhere. You could find they, them being used to refer to people who have gender pronouns everywhere. This is not like a new thing that's being forced upon people. Not at all. So going from there, like I said, spectrum. You could have non-binary people in the middle for this example, and then maybe you are feeling like a little bit more related to non-binary, but you do have a tendency to lean a little bit to the male side. Then you would be a demi-boy, demi-guy. So it's like non-binary with a little bit of a preference in like this direction, or a demi-girl would be with a little bit of a preference towards the female direction. You can land anywhere like on the spectrum essentially, right? And most people probably do to some degree, but they just identify more with these stronger like words that we use, right? Those words might describe how we feel comfortable in ourselves the best. So from there, I hope that makes a lot of sense to people that don't really understand this. It does get a hell of a lot more complex than this, and this is by no means like a rule book for how these things work. Every person experiences their gender pretty much like completely unique to everybody else. It's a very individualistic experience. It's just pretty important to note these things when we're talking about that there's not, like, it seems to be really hard to pin down hard rules for these things. And so it comes down to the individual and their preference for how they feel. Now, from there, now we're going to go a little bit into the next statement. I think I've talked about it already a little bit. Genderless does exist. Essentially what that statement means is just that non-binary people are real, they're valid. It's really hard to argue against those points. We can even see non-binary, for example, you could be without even talking about gender and being non-binary as a gender, we could even talk about how you could be hormonally non-binary, which means that the natural hormones in your body just seem to be at some kind of equilibrium or even like a non-existence between the two. These things are things that naturally occur between lots of people. It's most certainly a thing that happens, right? And this can lead somebody to feeling like they identify more with being non-binary because maybe their hormones are like a little bit more equal, right? Or maybe they're skewed to some side that's a little bit opposite for somebody of their biology. Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. These things most certainly exist. Scientifically, we have lots of evidence of these things. This statement mostly is just more of the same between everything else here. And getting into trans issues a little bit. Trans men are men, trans women are women. What do those statements mean? Essentially, it just means that trans men are valid men because trans men are they're choosing, like their choice of gender is men. That makes them valid as men. That's pretty much, it's a very, very simplistic statement. Trans women are women. If we think about everything that I've already talked about here, we can easily reach these conclusions from that, right? Because the criteria for being a man is very much a self-determined thing, like I said, right? When we're talking about like trans people, I think a lot of people get this idea that I could dress as like a burly man and say that I'm a woman just for the sake of getting attention and stuff like that. And that's how a lot of people perceive trans people, is that they're just going against the norms for the sake of like, fuck the system, essentially. It's more, I find that trans people have like a much better understanding of these things, scientifically speaking, than most other people, and most of the people just aren't willing to listen. So it'd be nice to give a little bit of I guess attention, a little bit of consideration would be nice to the arguments that are being made, because a lot of it is really hard to contest beyond your own personal feelings of the matter or your own visceral reaction towards like the thought of trans people, right? We want to like base our opinions in reality. I'd like to talk a little bit about a Canadian who was born as a male but reassigned female and raised as a girl following medical advice and intervention after his male genitalia, his penis, was severely injured during a botched circumcision in infancy. So, his name is David Raymer. I might not be pronouncing the last name correctly, but essentially this story serves as a little bit of evidence to support the idea that people feel their gender to some degree. They identify with their actual gender to some degree, and they can determine it themselves. Of course, things will influence how they get to these like decisions. So if you're born with male or female genitalia, this can influence your gender. Your environmental factors surrounding you growing up, your family, your friends, and stuff like that. These things can influence, and like your cultural like background can influence your gender to some degree. But it's widely like to some degree it's widely unpredictable whether somebody's going to identify as one gender or another in our current with our current understanding of gender, because it's so complex. So this guy David Raymer was a Canadian, like I said, born male, and he was reassigned female because his genitals were mutilated accidentally after he was born. So essentially what happened was they figured that it was best to reassign him as female because he would have the best chance, essentially, like with fixing up his genitals and stuff like that. His best chance in society, essentially, is what they had decided. And they made a little bit of an experiment out of him too, unfortunately. Not always the greatest thing, but essentially they just studied him. He was essentially just told that he was a girl his whole life, up until the ages of, I believe, yeah, so it says here, ages 9 and 11, when he realized that he was, like, not a girl. Like, it just, nothing made sense. It's like, this doesn't feel right? That's the general idea. He later then transitioned to living as a male at age 15. So essentially what this serves as is evidence that somebody, like, he was born and his assigned gender at birth was female. That was what they assigned him, essentially, or at least they reassigned him to female. So all he'd ever known and was taught was that he was female, but it just didn't click right in his brain, right? He knew he was a guy the entire time, and it just wasn't making sense. This is pretty much like an example of how most trans people feel when they're born into their body and assigned a gender based on their genitalia, and it doesn't match how they feel. This is like an example of that, but it's a little bit flipped around because it ended up being somebody who was born with a penis who ended up like they're a male kind of thing. Like that's how they feel, that they're a guy. And it's a little bit like flipped, but it kind of proves more of the same, right? And just for context here, some right here. Unfortunately, later in his life, as you can see in this article here, he did commit suicide, unfortunately. It's a difficult situation. This is something that like really plagues the trans community. It is like higher rates of suicide. This is something that like is, I know like a lot of people, especially like on this gender forum and on Facebook, we're always talking about like suicide rates and stuff, right? And we're always like really worried about the suicide rates of guys and stuff, and rightfully so, for sure, right? We want to prevent as much of this as possible. I think that everybody who feels this way honestly does believe that. So why is our reaction, if we as individuals care about suicide rates, why do we as individuals continue to act in ways that increases the likelihood of trans people killing themselves? There's been lots of studies done out there that essentially show that if you were to just treat trans people like regular human beings, like they're valid and stuff, it's very, very simple. Just use their pronouns. Cool. Don't make a big deal about it. That the suicide rate would come right down. It's a very, very, very simple solution. Not everything ends up being that simple in most in this day and age anyways. And I'm sure there's more things we could do that can contribute to reducing that suicide rate in trans people for sure. But a huge factor of it is just how they're treated in society, right? They're just asking you to treat them like humans. Okay, here's some info that I have here. Approximately 0.5% of the population is transgender. I'm not sure exactly where this is based in. I tried to get Canadian stuff, but this might not be Canadian. Oh, it does .ca, so it's probably Canadian. Okay. Over 10% of transgender people report recently attempting suicide within the previous year. What's the general suicide rate? Okay, so here's the general rate. Seems like it's since they started recording it, it seems like it trended upwards and kind of goes up and down a little bit here. We're currently at about, I don't know, from the most recent number here, 11.3%. Does that translate over here? Okay, so here's some more. Yeah, I guess I can just read the rest of the statistics. Trans people are 2 times more likely to think about and attempt suicide than lesbian, gay, or bisexual people. 22 to 43% of transgender people have attempted suicide in their lifetime. That's huge. Or 2/3 of trans youth reported recent self-harm within the previous year. This is huge, right? Like, this is a huge statistic. That's a massive chunk of the population, right? So if we really, really care about trans people, we should probably do something. In the bare minimum, just treat them like human beings, especially if we have all this evidence to support like how these things work, and all we really need to do is just educate ourselves a little bit. I was going to say something. Brain. What was I going to say? Oh, here's a good one. Okay, little thought experiment. So, would you as an individual, I'm sure that you have a gender identity. Okay, so as an individual, think about the gender that you identify with. This is probably mostly going to be going out to people who are like cisgendered, so like people who identify with the gender that they were assigned to at birth. So most people are probably going to be picking between like female, or no, sorry, not female, between woman or man here for gender. So think about the gender that you were assigned at birth. Now, think about if you were to go out to the grocery store and you're going through the till, and somebody were to call you the opposite gender. So, say you're a guy or whatever going through the till and they say, "Hey, ma'am." Or if you're a girl going through the till and they say, "Hey, mister," or "sir." That seems incorrect, right? Like, you'd probably have some amount of issue with it. Maybe you're not maybe you don't really care that much, but it is incorrect at least, right? To some degree. Now, think that you correct this person. So you tell them, oh, actually, I'm whichever your pronouns are. I'm her, I'm he, whatever it is. And their reaction is, no, you're not. You're this gender. Can you see where you might have a problem with this? Where this might become a little bit frustrating, right? Like they're determining how they want to identify you, essentially. That's something that's up to you, right? Does this give you a good little perspective on like how it is to be, like just a little example on a one interaction that a trans person might encounter? And it might not be exactly like that. I highly doubt that that exact example is probably something that happens crazy often. It's mostly online discourse, I think, but that's kind of the point, right? Just put yourselves in those shoes, right? And especially if you haven't, if you're just hopping in this video right now, you definitely want to go back a little bit and pay attention to the arguments I made earlier about why gender is a spectrum, right? And understanding that, right? Because that's pretty important when we're determining why this would be wrong, because we self-determine gender. Let's see. Oopsies. Cool. So, I think I've made most of the arguments that I want to make. Hopefully I've gotten through to some people and at least explained why gender is at least a little bit more complicated than we understand it to be. I'm positive that there'd be no arguments that anyone could make right now anyways that would persuade me to believe that you can define X gender very easily by these variables and stuff. And that our understanding of gender is just a little bit simplistic compared to how it actually works. I'd like to close off with just making a statement that trans people and gender issues in general, and gender being a spectrum, this is a very widely recognized thing, right? So not only can we make pretty good arguments as to how we understand gender to come to those conclusions, but also that a wide list of scientific organizations and medical organizations have all come to overwhelming consensus that trans people are valid, that there are more than two genders, easily peasily, that genderless is a thing. Hello. For pizza? Very good. Yes.
I just let him inside because he looked like he was freezing. So.
No worries. All G.
In my suite. I don't know.
It's paid for, yeah. You just grab it. I paid for it, yeah. Yeah, it's all good. Yeah. So, sorry, continuing. Lost my train of thought. It is the overwhelming scientific and medical consensus that trans people are valid, that there are more than two genders, that genderless is a thing. These are all things that can be scientifically proven, and this is the scientific consensus. These things, it's really, if you are arguing with whether or not there are two genders or not, you're not arguing with trans people. You're arguing with the scientific consensus. You're arguing with evidence. It's uncontestable, at least to this point. If you can find actual scientific evidence against it, go hard. But that's just not the case right now. That's not the overwhelming consensus. And yeah, I'm gonna leave it off pretty much with that. There's a list here. Just post it real quick here. This list of organizations all agree that trans people are valid. There's lots of information here. This is called the Ultimate Research Document by Vosh. It's got all this information. It's got lots of other issues too about racism and stuff. But it's got lots of great what's the word? Resources. It's got lots of great resources for backing up all of these claims, essentially, that you guys can check out. Anyone can check out that's watching this if you disagree, and then go hard and disagree with any of this. I know I've looked up as well. The Canadian Psychological Association also agrees with these statements as well. I have it right here. Gender identity in adolescents and adults. The Canadian Psychological Association affirms that all adolescent and all adult persons have the right to define their own gender identity, regardless of chromosomal sex, genitalia, assigned birth sex, or initial gender role. Moreover, all adolescent and adult persons have the right to free expression of their self-defined gender identity. Boom. Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm going to end this off on, is just a little bit more evidence to back it. And yeah, thanks for popping on. I hope that you guys learned a little bit of something. If you didn't know a lot of this stuff already, you guys can always contact me if you want to have a discussion about this. If you disagree, send me a message, join the Discord. The link is in the bottom there. If you have any issues or whatever and you want to hash it out, I'd be super happy to have any kind of conversation that you guys want to have. And yeah, that's pretty much that. I am hopping off. Have a good night. Bye-bye.